Thank you very much, Ian. The main point I want to try to get over this morning to you is that England is extremely unusual in Europe. English society is very unusual in Europe, and an appreciation of this might help an understanding of what is happening in education and why it's happening in education, how education is shaped by our society and the changes in our society, and then in turn how the education system we have, I'll say again in England, is then shaping and reinforcing the differences in our society. We are the most unequal country in Western Europe when it comes to income inequalities, income gaps. And as the gaps between us widen, the importance for children of trying to place themselves high up that social scale increases. So over the course of my lifetime, I've watched us go from a position where, when I was a child, you went to the local school, there were no league tables, most children left at 15 or 16, but quite a lot at 15, because I'm old enough that there were still jobs in the car factory back in Oxford then. And the pressure to do well in exams was much, much less. Not just for children in normal schools, but also for children in very expensive schools, who could go into the city without doing very good exams, could join the guards without doing good exams, could marry well without doing well in exams, didn't have to go to university. That's all changed over the course of my lifetime. The greatest pressure is actually on our most, well, we call them privileged kids, to do well. If you go to some of the most expensive schools in the country, you will watch children being hothoused to get A's and A stars because they have to get A's and A stars. And watching a whole class of boys being forced to get A's and A stars through being taught late into the night is new, and I don't think they're particularly privileged, to be honest, by what they're going through. These two images, I think, are useful to think about how society changes and how fast society can change. They're both taken from the annual Harrow-Eton cricket match. The top image was taken at that match just before the outbreak of the First World War. And if you look at the confidence of the boys there, and their mothers wearing bits of birds in their hair, and so on, you can see the end of an old era. 1913 was the most unequal we had ever got to in England. Around about 1913, the best off 1% took about a quarter of all income. The big houses had many servants. Being a servant was still the most common occupation for women in the country. That all changed during the First World War, immediately after the First World War, during the 1920s, and during the 30s. Inequalities in this country tumbled. People didn't notice that they were tumbling. It's very interesting to look back at the time. But half of the gain we got towards becoming the most equal we've ever been, which was in the 1970s, was actually achieved before the Second World War. And the second picture there, I think, epitomizes it. It's a very famous picture. Of course, you could have taken pictures like this at any time. It's more that these were the ones that newspapers chose to publish. And that 1936 picture there of the two boys, again from Harrow, you can tell they're Harrow because they got a cane, in case you ever need to know how to spot the difference. The two boys from Harrow are looking very unsure of themselves in 1936, and the three working class boys are looking very sure of themselves. Society was changing. The curve there is the share, the take of the 1%. I'm not picking on the 1% because it's topical, although that helps. I'm picking on the 1% because it turns out that if you look at changes since 2008 in income inequalities, the cleavage now is between the 1% and the rest. The 1% has carried on zooming off. HMRC released statistics this spring showing that in the last year the 1% had what I think is their biggest increase ever in income. The Institute of Fiscal Studies also released statistics around this time showing that for the rest of us, for the 99%, we'd actually become more equal. In fact, income inequalities for the 99% have now got back to the level they were at last in 1990. Partly because welfare benefits had not been cut as much as they are being cut now, but also because child benefit was taken away from people at the top. It really doesn't matter to the 1%, at least half of them I don't think claim child benefit because the effort isn't worth the money. And of course the rest of the top 10% didn't benefit when top tax rates came down to 45%. So we're now in a situation in Britain where we are all in it together, as long as you forget about the best off 1%. People often say the 1% don't matter, they're only 1%, but they are taking 15% of all income. And more importantly than that, being this unequal changes much else about our society. In this city, I think between 20 and 25% of all secondary school children are going to private schools. I don't think there is anywhere else in Europe which has a proportion that high. But I'm going to stop in 30 minutes, and I would love it if you tell me I'm wrong and there is somewhere else where it is that high. 20 to 25% going private. That changes your attitudes about education. It changes what the elites think about education. Education, state education, isn't for them or their children. It just isn't normal if you're in the top of society, particularly if you're in London or in Oxford, where I think at least 30% of secondary school children go to private schools in Oxford. It's an incredibly skewed geographical pattern when you look at that. And of course, it's not just the private school, state school divide. There is a very similar divide in the state sector. It's simply about house prices and catchment areas. And there's a lovely overlap between how much you have to pay for your house to live in a certain catchment area and what school fees are. And those two things tend to balance out. I tend not to like PISA statistics. I'm a geographer, so I'm not an educational person, but the PISA stuff was invented partly by a physicist, which I think is even worse, with a particular obsession with bell curves and IQs and so on. However, the international statistics on numeracy are safer. It is easier, I think, and again, you're the right people to tell me why I'm wrong. I think it is easier to compare ability and numeracy between countries rather than, say, literacy, because some countries have more complicated languages than others. There is the league table that you'll know for numeracy. The nice thing is to test people's ability away from their exam period. So this is 16 to 24-year-olds. We have an incredibly exam-focused culture, which means that we train children to peak the day before they take the exam, say in GCSE mathematics, so they can get an A. The number of people I know of my age and younger who are taught to get an A but are completely innumerate is shocking. I can go on about this. The second graph there, the top graph, is showing you an international measure of how much people talk themselves up in different societies, how often people are likely to say that they're better than average. And the more unequal country you're in, the more likely people are to say that they're better than average. I'm afraid the UK, we don't have statistics to put us on there, but we can guess where we are. If you want a way of characterising the UK, and this is very nasty stereotyping, so I apologise, but often behind stereotypes there is some truth. We look to other Europeans a bit like people from the USA look to us, over the kind of brashness and self-confidence about our societies and how we think we've got it right, despite, for instance, the fact that the USA has the highest rate of imprisonment in the world, higher even than Rwanda. Children in California are more likely to end up in prison than university now. 2 million people in prison. It's a failed society. We can see that, but we have more people in prison per head than anywhere else in Western Europe. And it's not because our courts are particularly vindictive. We're actually less likely to put somebody in prison for an offence of a similar level of violence than people in other European countries. It's just that our young people commit more violence. We're a more violent, more disruptive society. And I think that has to be related to the gaps between us, to the opportunities that people have. If you look at my end of education, which is the university end, you see this incredible escalation now where, certainly in Oxford, students feel they failed if they've got a 2-2, partly because we give so few 2-2s. The enormous increase in people paying to take postgraduate qualifications, people paying, and in London as well, paying to take PhDs. This really is very, very new. When I did a PhD back in the 1980s, it was seen as very odd. Hardly any of us did it. It was seen as a mistake for our career ladder. And you wouldn't get on the housing ladder fast enough. You would lose out because you wouldn't be able to buy a house. And so we've gone from something like a PhD being an esoteric, very odd qualification to being something that in a way you can buy. And that's an incredible change over that time. We have stepped down. The incredible change since 2008 is we've seen rises in absolute poverty. We've seen food kitchens coming in. We have soup kitchens in Oxford now. I want to try to work out at some point whether as many people, families in Oxford, are being fed through soup kitchens as are being fed in university dining halls. And I suspect that the numbers may be similar. That cartoon is from a long time ago. If you add 2 noughts to it, you get a kind of image of where we are today. And we have this division widening, which Oxfam in particular have been very good to highlight. In more unequal countries, there are many more less rewarding jobs to do. So again, if you look at the United States, you'll find that the number of people who are involved in cleaning for other people, gardening for other people, caring for other people's children, having a nanny, having 2 nannies and so on, is very high. Around about 2008, 2009, the only occupation that was increasing in number for young people in Britain was waiting on tables. We had an increasing number of people working as waiters and waitresses. In the last 2 or 3 years, the big job boom for the young has been estate agents. I find these figures hard to believe, but they're published figures on the proportion of new jobs, net new jobs, which have been taken up by a estate agency. And this involves wearing a cheap suit, driving around all day, spending half an hour with couple after couple, lying about property. Now, it's not, I may be being unfair, but this is British estate agency. In a more normal, settled European country, we are in Europe, houses turn over far less frequently. You tend to only buy once when you want to be stable. The prices don't go up. Germany is the best example of this. And estate agency is a calmer, safer, more realistic kind of job to go into. And I think we need to worry about this. The map there just shows one image of our wealth inequalities. Our wealth inequalities are now growing rapidly, very, very rapidly. Wealth inequalities tend to lag behind income inequalities. In the last 4 years, the wealth of landlords in this country has increased by 245 million. No, 245 billion. Sorry, it's 245 billion, I think. It's a Savills figure from the FT, but it's an incredible switch. We've seen fewer and fewer people who are able to take out mortgages. We're seeing it becoming normal to rent. This is a switch. People are looking at renting for their whole life as being likely again, partly because the wealth is transferring to those who own the property. It's worse in the United States. This is a very famous map produced in the United States to try to give you an idea of wealth inequalities in the United States. The figures are from 2007. And the reason they're from 2007 is that when they tried to redraw this map in 2010, the bottom 40% were all in the Atlantic. They actually had negative wealth. And when you added in their housing equity, it got even worse. because the bottom 40% did include people who owned some houses, but their negative equity was greater than their positive equity. That situation getting worse in the United States resulted in Obama acting. In the US, they have now raised taxes slightly. They have done various things, because when you get to a point where so many people in your society have so little to lose, it becomes increasingly dangerous. Here's a map for the UK showing the country. That is the region, sorry, it's not the UK, it's only England, I'm afraid. Showing the regions of England and the boroughs of London sized by the increase in the value of property over the course of the last year. That map's now out of date. The escalation during this year has been even greater than the escalation last year. There is lots of talk about it slowing down, but there is as yet no evidence from any land registry figures of the bubble slowing down. There's lots of talk about is it a bubble or not, so just look at the map, I think, to think. It doesn't tell you when it's going to pop, but it kind of shows you what's happening in the country at the moment. Very unequal country, becoming much more unequal very quickly. All these things are closely connected. You have to worry about housing if you're worrying about education. You have to worry about inequality if you're worrying about education. The worry about housing, of course, is the price of making it into certain catchment areas, and then what happens. Because as I'll show you a bit later, there's an even worse thing happening in housing, which is going to affect schools very badly in the years to come. I like drawing these maps. This is just a population map of the UK, just showing you how big London is and how important it is for us to understand what's going on. Within the top 1%, you have incredible inequalities. There is more inequality within the top 1% than there is in the other 99%. People in the bottom half of the top 1%, constantly complain about how hard it is to get by. Now, I'll show you those. The entry level to the 1% in the UK is a household income of £160,000 a year. Hardly any head teachers on their own are in the 1%. Two head teachers together, maybe a super head taking over some school, they can just about get themselves into the 1% if they do that. But £160,000 doesn't get head teachers into the 1% anymore. In the 1970s, head teachers were in the 1%, but the 1% took 3 times less than they take today. It was a much wider group. Basic numeracy, there will always be a 1%. You often hear people say, we've got to get rid of the 1%. Right? There will always be a 1% under any society you have. The question is, when do they start taking too much? When do they start coming simply from one profession? When do they become more and more dislocated from the rest of us? So that they become more concerned about their own position because they feel poor. And particularly in London, people with household incomes of £160,000, £200,000 don't feel well off. They're having to pay these school fees. They feel it's absolutely obligatory. If 20% of kids are going to private schools, theirs have to. If they have 2 or 3 teenage children, that's quite a high price. If their kids go and pass some entrance exam for some particular prestigious school, who are they not to pay the extra? And then, of course, they've got to get themselves a house. And they might just want a 3-bed house, but that will cost them a fortune. At the very top, you have the super rich. This is a map of the country where I've stretched it to show the wealth of the 1,000 richest people according to the Sunday Times. And there's London, and there are the 10 richest families in London. And if you look at that, you can see how it's possible for all the other super rich people in London to feel they don't have that much because they've got the blue area left over after those 10 families have been taken out. And you can, it's a really interesting curve. It's a curve like this. It's incredibly steep at the top. So it's very easy, no matter where you are along the curve, to think you're normal because you tend to know people quite near to you, and to think that those above you have much, much more because they do. The steps get bigger the higher up you get. Dropping down becomes much, much, much scarier. Here's the country as a whole. I always think it's interesting that Scotland is smaller than Ireland in terms of the very wealthy that are there. But you get an idea about where the real concentration of enormous amounts of wealth is held. And this affects people in the rest of the 1%, and it also affects our society more widely. A lot of these people are donors to political parties, and the parties they tend to donate to are parties that favour inequality levels remaining as they are. There are a lot of Russians donating to political parties at the moment. We have 2,000 millionaire Russian families in London. They have a direct vested interest in this situation not being altered. I'm going to show you some comparisons now with other countries. This is the first time I've shown these stats because I thought I'd better check some of the stats that are out there. This comes from a European survey of household incomes, and it's all in euros. It shows you that the median household in Germany and France is actually better off than the median, the middle household in the UK. But the entry level, the cut-off to get into the 1% is much, much higher in the UK. The UK has as much, if not more money overall, but more of it is going to people at the top. So that the person who's just made it into the 1% is getting 6.3 times more than the median for the household that they're in. Here's the IFS income distribution. If you've got very good eyesight, you can work out where you are. And it's a very skewed distribution. You have to go back to the 1930s to find a distribution that looks like this. But as I say, it is becoming slightly more equal for 99% of those people. As they become nastier over benefit sanctions at the bottom, and if benefits really do rise as slowly as they're trying to increase them, then that equalisation amongst the 99% won't continue. But at the moment, most of that curve is becoming a little bit better, but that top little 1% is zooming off. And politically, that's very interesting, because politically, we've never had a situation before where the 1% and the rest of the 10% have not travelled together. When Margaret Thatcher got into office in 1979, the 9%, the group just beneath the 1%, had 2.5 times median incomes. They're doing okay. But by the time she left office, the 9% had 3 times median incomes. Margaret Thatcher's government improved materially the lot of that group, as well as helping the 1% a lot. And if you're helping the whole top 10% and they're getting more, I think it's relatively easy to get their support. How you keep the support of the top 10% when 9 out of 10 of them are actually beginning to feel the pinch from their point of view is trickier. Here's a comparison of 6 countries. It's not my comparison. It comes from a book produced by 2 American professors. In the 1970s, we were the second most equal country of these 6. We're now the second most unequal country. In the USA, the top 1% take 20% of all income. This is a huge amount. In UK, if you include a little bit of tax dodging, I think it's around about 15%. And you could stack up how much that costs you. You start off with the NHS. You can add schools. You can add other things. 15% of your national income is an enormous amount of money. The Netherlands is at the bottom there, the most equal of these countries. And although their graph ends a few years ago, the figure for last year for the Netherlands is still under 7%. So people in the Netherlands are taking less than half as much at the top of society than the UK. And so the kind of quote you get from the Netherlands, I think it was the boss of Royal Dutch Shell said, "You could pay me twice as much and I wouldn't work any harder. You could pay me half as much and I'd work just as hard." You never hear those kind of quotes from anybody at the top of British society, because the whole of society is made more different as these inequalities widen. People begin to justify them. They say they're good. They say they're needed. They say that everywhere's running the same global race, and so you have to have this. And they don't want you to look at these kind of diagrams. They don't want you to know that the Swiss 1% take half as much as our 1%, and they still have bankers in Switzerland who did a slightly better job in 2008 and 2009, despite being paid half as much. For those of you who like your stats, along the bottom you've got the Gini index of inequality, and along the side you've got the 1%. They're very closely correlated. I happen to think that the 1% is actually a better measure than the more complicated measures. because so many who run countries are in or near the 1%, that if the 1% are nearer the normal, your elite tend to behave much, much better, partly because they're less stupid, to put it very crudely. They're less likely to have been socially isolated. I grew up in Oxford. I was fairly socially isolated. I was the son of a GP, just the son of a GP who went to a normal school. But when I was 16 or 17, I saw these rowdy Oxford University students, many of whom had been in boarding school, and they turn up to Oxford. I'm exactly halfway, I think, between Osborne and Cameron in age, so you can work out how we overlap. I went up to Newcastle to university. That group went off to London to work. If you spend 10 years from 1986 to 1996 in Newcastle, you get a very different idea of what was happening in Britain than if you go to work for a job in Carlton TV that your mum's sorted out for you at around about the similar age. It's not your fault you know so little if you are so socially isolated. You're much more likely to be socially isolated in a country like Britain. In most of mainland Europe, the elites send their children to state schools. Okay, fairly privileged state schools, but they still mix more. We just are very unusual. We have more very rich people in this country. Germany has a bigger population, but we have more multimillionaires per head, and we're becoming a butler, if you like, for the world's super rich. We're trying to welcome them in and their children to our schools. One of the main export industries of Oxford is the private schools, because it can bring in children from overseas and their families who want to live there so their children can go to these schools. This is a graph from Piketty and his colleagues, just showing the relationship in the United States between how much the 1% took there over time and an index of how they deregulated the tax system so that they could take more, so that they could risk more in banking. This is a graph that George Monbiot and people at the New Economics Foundation produced from data accidentally released by the ONS of an estimate of wealth inequality by percentile. ONS really don't want you to see this figure. It's probably an underestimate because of the super wealth of the wealthy amongst the 1%, but just to give you an idea of where we are. I said that these things interact, and I'll just give you one example that I think is really important. It's happening now. This graph comes from one of Alan Milburn's reports for the Child Poverty and Social Mobility Commission. It's the proportion of households with children in England who are privately renting. And you'll see this huge increase, up to now about a quarter, very rapid increase in private renting amongst households, amongst families with children. This wasn't planned. It's part of the kind of fallout of the crash and what happened. And it's caused by the fact that families with children, particularly in London and the South East, can be outbid by couples without children for property. What's happening is they're having to rent privately. Rapid return to mass private renting. The problem with this from the point of view of education is that you can be chucked out of your house with 2 months' notice if you're a private renter. The idea of expanding the private renting system in Britain was it would be people without children who would increasingly privately rent. But it's people with children who are increasingly privately renting. On average in London, the average household who's privately renting is moved on every year. That's the average. For kids, that means that you end up losing all your friends and having to move school several times in your childhood. I'm sure, even given my lack of knowledge about education, it's probably not a good idea to involuntarily have to move schools and lose all your friends several times throughout your childhood. And what's happening, particularly in London, is that rents are rising rapidly and families with children are being outbid by couples without children because the couples without children have a bit more spare money, so they can pay a bit more on the rent because they don't have to buy the clothes. Cutting child benefit or capping it isn't going to help this situation. It really is a staggering change in a very short amount of time. More has happened in the last 5 years in this country than in the whole period that I've studied since the 1970s. I spent most of my career talking about very subtle, nuanced differences. You know, was the north-south divide widening under New Labour or not? And we had to do very complicated stats, and if we did it slightly differently, we got a slightly different result. That's out of the window. Completely out the window now. People don't bother to talk about the north-south divide widening because it's become a chasm. You know, all these things that we develop complicated ways of looking at matter less and less. We thought we weren't going to be measuring absolute poverty anymore, so the argument was all about relative poverty. And now we have rises in absolute poverty. And it's very, very different in countries which are very near us. Here's the Netherlands. The Netherlands is the middle country of the OECD when it comes to inequality. Half the countries are more equal than the Netherlands. If you want a model of what British society could be or could aim for, look to the Netherlands for how things are done in the Netherlands. Or look to Switzerland. When they tell you that it is inevitable that inequalities will increase, you need to ask, well, why didn't that happen in Switzerland and the Netherlands? Different things have happened in different countries. We are, if you like, the dunce of the class. We're the one who, for various reasons, got it most wrong. I think I showed that slide in Scotland a few weeks ago. Here is the reduction in the top tax rates for the very rich in the USA, and how average Americans have not seen those reductions. Very similar in Britain. Top tax rates come down in general, apart from that one little increase under the last government, only at the very end of the last government. Other taxes like VAT rise, other pseudo-taxes, which is electricity, gas bills, rent, all the things you have to pay which in effect are taxes, have been rising. And then we get back to education again. I use statistics from Dana Ray, and these come from the OECD, and they're 2 or 3 years out of date, so they may have been superseded. But according to these statistics, the only country in the OECD which spent a higher proportion of its income on private education is Chile. Everywhere else spends less. We spend about 25%, some of it on private tutoring, most of it on private schools. The result is that the average child in a private school gets about 4.5 times more spent on their education than the average child in a state school. When Nelson Mandela was giving his speech before the judge, that's the famous speech he had to give before the judge decided whether to hang him or not, he reeled out a series of education statistics. It's a really interesting speech to look at if you're nerdily interested in education statistics. And the most stunning one he read out was how black children in South Africa had between 6 and 12 times less spent on their education than white children. Now you can see those kind of inequalities in some parts of the States. We're not there yet, but if you carry on having austerity and reduce budgets and bigger class sizes in Britain, and if private school fees carry on going up at the rate they're going up, we're heading to that Mandela statistic that he quoted there. Things could get much worse. This is a graph about pensions. Bring it home a bit more to some of you in the room, or more of you in the room. Or a reason, and in fact anybody working in a university. Have anybody got the email from the union about your pension? What's happening? You need to look at the States. Things can get much, much, much worse. We tend to think that it's not possible. It couldn't happen. Just look at the distribution of pensions in the States and what's happened there. Another graph from the IFS. I apologise for a number of these graphs, but often people don't believe you when you kind of wave your arms around and say this is happening, but it's in the stats. This is the IFS's distribution of the effects of the cuts up until 2016 now rather than 17. The richest 10% only appear to be doing better because they include the richest 1%. Take the richest 1% out, and as I said, 9 out of 10 of that group are not doing better because of changes to national insurance, because of losing child benefit, and because their incomes have not actually been rising. Incomes have been dropping in places like the BBC at the top. Director General is now paid, I think, half as much as the Director General about 3 DGs ago. Most people are against inequality in most countries of the world. It's an interesting distribution. It's not easily predicted. But if you ask people about it, they really say they don't like it. But of course, when you then say what you want to do about it, it's much harder. People tend not to be in favour of redistribution, particularly if it affects them. It may be easier, I think, to talk about curtailing the excesses of the 1% rather than talk more vaguely about redistribution, particularly if your 1% are that important to your society. I'll leave that one up but won't explain it, but it's just about housing for anybody who's particularly nerdy. But just to give you one last example on this, if you look at bankers' pay, one bank in this country, Barclays Bank, the bank I actually joined as a student at the age of 18 in Newcastle and are still a customer of, Barclays Bank pay over 300 people £1 million a year in salary. In the whole of Japan, all companies, all institutions put together do not pay 300 people over £1 million a year. The Japanese 1% take the least of any rich country in the world. Japan has a 90% middle class and the highest life expectancy in the world and does pretty well in education. Not just pretty well. I did a little survey in different countries around the world where I asked people about distributions. I held up my hand and I asked them what they thought the median was, what they thought the best off 20% was, what I thought the worst off 20% were getting, and so on. In lots of areas of England, it's very hard to do this because people really can't understand quintiles. No matter how hard you try and you hold up your hand. I was utterly shocked to do this in a poor area of Japan and for a young schoolboy to reel off exactly the correct figures to me, simply just knowing what it was. That's entirely possible, but it requires a different kind of society. The European Commission published data about top pay. We have over 2,200 bankers in this country paid over €1 million a year. The next highest country in Europe is Germany, where they have 197. Right? It is that stark, it is that different. And our government is opposing legislation to try to stop this getting worse, because it believes inequality is good. Those who are most aspirational rise to the top, and the rest of us rely on their brilliant skill to be able to survive. This, I hope, is my last graph. Again, it comes from Piketty and his colleagues. Along the y-axis, you've got the increased take of the 1% since the 1960s. They've gone up most in the UK and the USA. And on the x-axis, you've got the drop in the top rate of tax over that period. Top income taxes are really important. What top income tax does isn't raise money in a sensible country. What it does is help people who like money stop trying to ask for quite as much, because they won't get most of it if they're having to pay a rate of 70, 80 or 90 once they earn $500,000, $1 million, $1.5 million. It deters greed. Our 1% are currently paying a third of all our income tax. They like to tell us how useful they are because they're doing this. But they're only paying a third of all our income tax because they pay themselves so much and everybody else so much less that so many people are not paid enough to be able to pay tax. Final thing to worry about, and this is kind of worse, because you can begin to see how you can begin to sort things out in some of these countries. I had a meeting with a colleague from the States last night who was very optimistic about what's happening in the States. He thinks they might have hit a peak in the States and we might be beginning to see a turn, in which case we have to celebrate the turn. It's quite possible to imagine we might be getting a turn in the UK at some point in the future, simply because it's incredibly expensive and inefficient to have this degree of inequality. And for a country with the kind of debt we've got, it's very hard to justify. But worldwide, you've got a bigger problem. Oxfam produced Oxfam's most cited statistic of 85 people having the wealth of the bottom half of humanity, and then Forbes magazine corrected them and said it's 67 and then 66. This is a bigger global problem. In a way, it's similar to where I started off, to England in 1913. England in 1913 was a ridiculously unequal country, and the people at the top then had even more than the people at the top in London have now. And nobody could see it changing. It looked stable, it looked solid. And then it came down rapidly. When it tends to turn for good and tends to change for decades and decades. Partly because the moral sentiment about what's right and proper changes. To end on education, before I ask you to please think of some questions for me, this is the context in which we are bringing up children and teaching children. This is the context in which schools are being made to compete with each other. This is the context in which young people are taught that the most important thing in life is to do well in these exams, that they have to go to university because they have almost no future otherwise, that which university they go to now matters, and that they should go into a course such as marketing or business or law, which can get them a job, which gives them a chance of aspiring to be in the 1%. So we're skewing what we tell and how we teach our children to fit in with this very, very unequal society. At some point, people are going to work out that only 1% can fit in the 1%. At the point... The reason it takes, I think, so long to work that out is that we are very bad at numeracy. But I am optimistic about this, not least because if you come back to where I'm now teaching, if you look at Oxford and Cambridge take about 1% of all children in Britain. Until recently, those 1% were absolutely guaranteed to do well. They might not feel that they're doing well because they don't become Prime Minister or something else. But they almost all could do pretty well. But now that only the 1% are moving away, and those just beneath them are actually seeing living standards falling slightly, the majority of Oxford and Cambridge students cannot get into the 1% because there is competition from other people to get in. When you get to a position where the majority of Oxbridge graduates are looking at a system which is not even in their interests, unless they are also unimaginative, that they think that they're better than the other graduates that they're with. When you get to that situation, I find it extremely hard to think that the pressure to begin to change this will not rise. What are all these graduates going to do? Europe has never had more university graduates before. It's never educated its children as much as it's done now. And we never had fewer children than now. We stopped having children in the 1970s and 80s. We have the smallest generation compared to the rest of the population we've ever had in Europe and in the UK. And we've never had fewer jobs for them to do. They're going to begin to work this out for themselves. 25 million unemployed young people across Europe. Large numbers educated up to 21, 22, 23. It's simply not sustainable, I think, to carry on in this way. The question is, what kind of things are going to tip it? And when it begins to tip, are we going to keep on pushing it just to get back to being a more equal country, which is what we were when I grew up, which is what most of Europe is, and which is what most people appear to want? Thank you very much.
Two or three questions.
Yeah, just two.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. We've got 10 minutes or so for questions, and we've got some roving mics. So what I'm going to do, take two questions, try and keep them very concise, please, so that we have time for answer, and then perhaps go on to some more. Could you indicate if you would like to put a point or ask a question to Danny, who has indeed given us plenty to worry about? Who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Down there, Dave. Yeah. There's a mic just coming.
I've got most of your books. I think you do fantastic stuff. You mentioned Nicotine Wilkinson. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm Dave Hill. I've got most of your books, Danny. I think you do fantastic work. You mentioned a couple of books. What books would you recommend Your top 5. You mentioned Piketty, and I presume you'll mention the spirit level. And just a slight post question. Knowing your political origins and where you are now, similar to mine, I was surprised at your reformist last comment about getting back to where we once were. Presumably you and many people actually want to do much better in terms of inequality than going back to, say, 30 years ago.
Anybody else for a second question before Danny comes to that? No, please answer that one, Danny.
Okay, my memory's not good enough to be able to do 5. Interestingly, my American colleague last night said, why have there only been 2 really successful books, The Spirit Level and Piketty? The Spirit Level was successful because it's a genuine scientific discovery. It's the equivalent to discovering that cigarettes give you lung cancer. You know, it was exciting because they didn't actually expect to find it. Piketty works well because he's a mild-mannered economist in the middle of politics who stumbled across this. And he's fairly good-looking and French, I think. But, Owen Jones' The Establishment is a very good read. I've read it. James Meek's new book about who's got what. But I would also read books and pamphlets written by people on the right to understand them. I would read that book, I forgot its name, but the one produced by a set of young Conservative MPs that said we don't work hard enough and so on. It's really easy just to read things that make you feel comfortable. If you do read and interact with people who believe that inequality is good for us, it's much easier to understand where they're coming from and what you're up against. So I would do that. I would love to be more utopian, but when you are at the bottom of the class, when you're the most unequal country in Europe, when you're doing this badly, it's a bit maybe like taking a child who's the bottom of the class and saying, I'd love that child to get to the top of the class, whereas it's actually an achievement to get that child to the middle of the class. And I honestly think it's almost the most we could hope for to become an average European country. We're not going to become Japan or Norway or Sweden or South Korea or France or even Icelandic society, which has withstood the terrible things that have happened to Iceland very well. We're so out there that it's going to take a generation or 30 years just to become normal. And then you could wish for more. Scotland's a great example. In Scotland, the main debate in Scotland was about this. It was about we do not want to be a society becoming ever more unequal. And the calm voices in Scotland, who wanted a yes, but the calm voices in Scotland who wanted a yes says, we have to realise that once you take away England, Scottish society is just as divided as England. The income and wealth gaps are just as big within it. And the political divides within Scotland would probably have been just as big. It was simply that dislike of London helped unify people. But take that away, and so Scottish aspiration, you don't become Denmark in 30 years. It took 200 years to become Denmark. If you know about Danish schools, you can't suddenly create that kind of system of schooling that fast. You have that there on your map of utopia. You've got an idea that there's a better way to be. But if you're starting off from this position, and you have some of the problems that we have, which includes the problems of having had a world empire, which alters our way of thinking and makes us feel we're more superior, that takes longer to kind of kick out, I think. But I'd have the aspiration, and maybe I'm affected by my generation, and people who are younger than me will be more enthusiastic about what's possible than I am, because, I came of age when the Conservatives came to power. My whole life I watched this. I thought that a new Labour government was going to do wonderful things. They did some good things, but I watched inequalities grow under them. I watched parts of the NHS being privatised. So maybe part of my realism is my time and the fact that I didn't see a more optimistic time in the 1960s or the 1950s. Should take another question.
Okay. There's one up there, right in the middle, if we can get a mic up there as quickly. Just while that's going up, Danny, following up the what is to be done theme, we're a room of educationists and educational researchers. You talked about educational outcomes as part of the worries. you got any thoughts about what is to be done by educationists and educational researchers in terms of addressing some of these challenges?
Well, there's a lot of you. There's more educational researchers than there are in other social sciences. I think it would be helpful if some of you directly took on people like Dominic Cummins on his own game. If you know, Dominic was the ex-advisor to the ex-education secretary. He's put online his thesis about how he thinks education works and about how he thinks the 1% have much higher IQs than the rest. It's in his... This is the man who was advising the education secretary. And the nice thing is, rather than talk in secret to his friends about this, he's published his thoughts with his citations and his evidence to say that only 1% of people are truly gifted, they are genetically different and clever, we have to give them more, the rest have to serve. I wish people would take Dominic's thesis and other writings of that kind, go to the original citations on the gene research and so on, work through it and explain the series of rather simple mistakes that people like Dominic made along the way. They can be influenced by worrying about being made to appear stupid because they're very worried about their own positions and egos. But that does involve getting slightly more engaged with quantitative research, which they tend to value higher, and it will involve getting engaged in genetic research. And there's a lot of genetic research coming out at the moment about genome-wide studies, which the vast majority of us social scientists tend to just walk away from. And if you walk away from it, you just simply leave the people who believe in eugenics writing all the papers. It's really hard work to understand what a genome-wide association is. There may be a slight twinge of geekiness amongst certain children with a whole range of genes that makes them slightly more geeky. That's as far as I think it goes, having read it. The wonderful news from the genome-wide research is that because it's a huge number of genes that makes a few more children slightly more geeky, it's not inherited. When you and another geek mix, you actually don't necessarily produce a geek. I'm partly saying this because I struggle with trying to cope with... I read this stuff, I think it's important. People who do believe that certain people are inherently superior love doing this research. And the problem is that people who don't like it don't look at it. And that is the research which underlies Gove's thinking, the new education secretary's thinking, their advisors' thinking. They're being told by people doing twin studies and genome studies that there are these inherent differences and we just have to live with that. And most people are destined to do pretty servile jobs, which is what that piece of distribution is all about. Just trying to find a few gifted and talented who have got it in them to be able to rule the rest of us.
Thanks very much. And our final question.
It's a political question, really. I mean, why do you think that the Labour Party aren't making political capital out of the data that you've been presenting? You know, Miliband's latest idea is a windfall tax on tobacco companies, not about raising income tax.
Yeah, and just 150 million of tobacco companies. I mean, it's tricky. I'm in a USS pension. The biggest investment of the USS pension is British American Tobacco. So we rely on people in China dying from smoking cigarettes for our pensions. I'm not in any political party. Perhaps that's part of the problem. People who agree with the kind of things I agree with tend to leave the Labour Party. So the Labour Party is left with loyalists who are quite managerial, and they don't like us because at least they're there and trying to do it. They are in a mess. I mean, the poor bloke forgot, you know, part of his... He appears to generally have forgot it. If you watched him yesterday, he looked nervous. I mean, it really is a bit of a mess that's going on. Andy Burnham last night couldn't explain where the money for the NHS was going to come from. I think it's cock-up. I think they are in a terrible, terrible mess. They're not being briefed to be able to cope with BBC interviewers, and that's not good. But that's my impression. Not helped by my university training them all in PPE, but anyway, we should, you know, I think there's a real lack of diversity of ability there, which means that they're finding it hard to even put a fairly mild-mannered program together. Well, if you take the mansion tax, the mansion tax is much more sellable if you just simply say, we'll have a progressive council tax, which will go up like this. Not a tip-off so that if your home's worth 2 million, you're in it, and if it's worth 1.999 million, you're not. You know, it's just a silly electoral thing to do. You can raise far more money in a far fairer way with a progressive council tax, and it's just as easy to implement. There's a real dearth. Part of the dearth is just if you look at political membership. I mean, there are hardly any members of these parties anymore. So there are fewer and fewer people who are interested and who are engaged. And so we have this kind of gap. People are still interested in these issues, but they've lost faith in the main parties to deliver. And that does cause real problems for the Labour Party. Much less problems for the Conservative Party because they don't actually need party workers to work. And they have a set of policies which they are going for, which are worked out amongst a smaller group of people, and it has to be said, are in favour of the 1%. But they truly believe on that party that if you look after the 1% will look after the rest. And I think medium term there's more to be gained by puncturing that perception of that's how things work on that side of politics than trying to get Labour to do a better job on its side of politics. Because I don't think it is that hard to explain to people that a few people getting richer isn't helping everybody else. And I honestly think that the majority of Conservative MPs are not devious. They truly believe that this is the best thing for everybody. That if a few people get better off, it'll help our country be strong and it'll help us. So if you can begin to delve into that belief, you have a bigger chance of maybe changing things and worrying about the kind of car crash of the Labour Party at the moment.